don't like all this distraction. I like her though. When I'm saying I like you, do you say I like her though? Are you repeating exactly what who you talking to, first of all?
Don't you think a joke about is doomed to be not funny?
It's possible, but I've heard them. You've
heard a funny joke?
I say a couple. Watch my HBO special. I'm pretty good at it. But it's something about this song. It deep to this loserdom
that all white people have.
That white people have this innate thing where they want to feel bad.
Patrice O'Neal was a stand-up comedian known for his fearless and unapologetic approach to comedy. His style was often described as controversial, as he fearlessly tackled sensitive topics such as race, gender, relationships, and societal norms. He was known to say whatever he wanted to say, regardless of whether or not someone was offended, and this attitude made him the most hated comedian of his time.
And she had this little scar on her forehead, and he comes walking up with his big finger. She was sitting down. They like that. And he pointed right at her scar, and she was like mortified. You just started off balance with him.
Yeah.
And then he just kept pushing your shoulder verbally. Every time you would start to regain your footing, he would find something else, and he would just trash you for an hour.
One of the defining characteristics of Patrice O'Neal's comedy was his raw honesty. He had a knack for delving into uncomfortable truths and taboo subjects, often challenging societal norms and expectations. But why was such a controversial comedian so respected in the industry?
He had his own truth, and he was going to tell you, and he wasn't going to take any prisoners. And that's a giant void to fill, Patrice O'Neal, because I felt he was the funniest guy in the world when he passed away.
Why was the comedian headlining and filling up shows? Let's get into it. Patrice Lumumba Malcolm O'Neal, December 7th, 1969, was an American stand-up comedian, radio personality, and actor. O'Neal grew up in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in a private house across from the projects, and he attended a suburban school, mostly white. At West Roxbury High, he played football well enough to earn an athletic scholarship, which he declined in order to study the performing arts at Northeastern. He worked as a bouncer at the Comedy Connection before climbing on stage, and then quickly went from holding doors for other comics to being one of the most promising among them. Many of his controversial shows had him saying negative things about women, and the public called him a misogynist and a bully. His views on women were indefensible, and yet they were delivered by a comedian with extraordinary charisma who was extremely funny. Patrice believed his work as a comedian was to be funny and thought-provoking while still being himself without being swayed by society.
We are outraged and fired and fired and fired. Name calling. I'm outraged. I am outraged.
You should be.
I am a fool. Now, called you a fool.
You don't know funny, I know funny, O'Neal proclaimed in countless interviews on the subject of taste and offense. He made his audience think about things differently, from an angle they wouldn't normally entertain or a perspective they'd usually reject.
Patrice would stop trashing them, so then they would pile on with Patrice, and then it was brutal. So then you'd have to try to get it off you onto somebody else. And you just, it was, yeah.
That's so awful.
It's so awful.
It sounds terrible.
No, it made us better.
He was a dangerous comedian, Ross said. You didn't know what was going to come out of his mouth, and a lot of fans are turned on by that. He really understood people, and he was unafraid of the audience disagreeing with him, which was beautiful, said comedian Jim Norton, a friend. Patrice O'Neal presented a challenge to the liberal comedy fan. Even comedians, who rarely shut up, had to surrender whenever Patrice O'Neal began to talk. He was a master at introducing subjects that you never even knew you had an opinion about.
The joke got a laugh. Patrice had a laugh that was so loud he could shut the crowd up.
Yeah.
And he knew when to laugh. He just knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
He was a nightmare.
Yeah.
He was a nightmare. I loved him to death.
If O'Neal was known for working his conversations off stage, he was equally well known for taking big risks with his audiences. If you watched Patrice, all his shows were different, and he didn't write any of his material down, said Bill Burr, a comic who came up with him in Boston. He got to it in a new way every night. As long as I knew him, he was always working on trying to attain a level of freedom on stage where he could just go up there and talk to the crowd. To me, that was the prior school of stand-up comedy. Of the many things O'Neal's peers admired about his performances, the assertions he got away with, the sly surprise of his punchlines, the seamlessness with which he skated between warmth and disgust, what excited them most was the way his shows built as his attention moved among his listeners, sparking off their fears and desires and stirring them up.
I want to get people to believe in something, but not be on a platform where you should. I just want to go, look, man, this is how I feel, and if I'm true to myself, then you might go, damn, I feel that way.
When you question a lot, you are wrong a lot, so wrong, but he'd present the case like a champion. Keith Robinson, a comedian and former roommate, said, "I'm arguing and at the same time thinking, how this dude is working this." O'Neal performed his first stand-up in October 1992 at Estelle's in Boston. He had attended an open mic night at the venue the week prior to his debut, where he heckled a performer, who in turn challenged him to try stand-up himself. Comedian Dane Cook witnessed one of O'Neal's earliest sets and noted his gentle appeal. He already had an edge, but he was a little more vulnerable. O'Neal developed his act in the Boston area for the next 6 years, where his earlier performances were done under the name Bruiser O'Neal. It was during this period that he met comedian and later close friend Jim Norton. In 1998, O'Neal relocated to New York City, working regular spots at the Comedy Cellar. In early 1998, he took part in the 4th annual U.S. Comedy Arts Festival in Aspen, Colorado. He then moved to Los Angeles in the hopes of finding greater fame. I tap danced like you wouldn't believe, trying to get something. O'Neal ignored demands from club owners to change his confrontational act and struggled to earn enough money.
He got kicked out of the club, though? Out of the cellar?
The cellar kicked him out.
Why?
I forget why.
Okay.
I forget why. He just for being Patrice.
He was essentially thrown out of America and accepted offers to perform in the UK, first by English stand-up John Simmet for a part on his upfront comedy circuit. O'Neal worked hard to gain the respect of his peers, recalling that it took several months for them to go, "Okay, this guy's not playing around." By mid-1999, he had headlined a comedy tour of Australia. Between 2000 and 2002, he performed stand-up across Europe, including spots at the Black International Comedy Awards in London and in Edinburgh with comedians Louis Schaffer and Rich Voss. He returned to the New York area in 2002, when he got the offer to do his first half-hour special for Showtime. The following year, he recorded a Comedy Central Presents special. It was also at this time he became a fixture on Tough Crowd, with Colin Quinn on the same network. O'Neal has had many guest appearances on television. His first television appearance was on the Apollo Comedy Hour, where he performed his Malcolm XXL bit. From there, he moved on to appearances on Showtime at the Apollo, F-Night Videos, and a brief stint as a writer for the WWE. Since his move back to New York in 2002, O'Neal became a recognized radio personality as a regular guest and occasional co-host on the Opie and Anthony program. Along with Bill Burr and Robert Kelly, he filled in as co-host for comedian Jim Norton while he filmed Lucky Louie. O'Neal also became the only non-staff member to guest host the show himself in November 2008 with Dante Nero. From 2006 to 2008, O'Neal hosted an call-in relationship advice show on XM Radio, which ended when the satellite network merged with rival Sirius. Initially promoted as B Management, the show was titled The Black Phillip Show, a reference to Dr. Phil. Dante Nero co-hosted, and a rotating cast of female comedians played third mic. The show aired until the station suspended much of its Saturday night programming due to budget concerns. O'Neal had also appeared as a guest on other radio shows like Alex Jones and The Howard Stern Show, and numerous guest appearances on Political Talk. In 2010, O'Neal recorded his first and only hour special for Comedy Central, Elephant in the Room. It originated after comedian Dave Attell had praised O'Neal's material to his manager, who entered discussions with the network about producing one. Despite O'Neal being adamant on filming in Washington, D.C., the network wanted it recorded in New York City, and O'Neal eventually agreed. The special premiered on February 19, 2011, with an uncut version released on CD and DVD 3 days later. O'Neal promoted the special with an interview on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, his first network television appearance in 4 years. In late 2000, O'Neal took a position as a writer for WWE after an associate of the company saw him perform. A big fan of professional wrestling, he pitched his idea for building a feud over 3 weeks that culminated in a pay-per-view event, which won him the job. He visited Vince McMahon's house, traveled with the organization for 1 week of live shows on their private jet, and directed some vignettes. He was then offered a 13-week contract, but turned it down as he already had plans. He later said that it wouldn't have been a dream if he had kept doing it, and that it was enjoyable because it was short and sweet. Later in his career, he also walked away from potential opportunities such as acting roles on Web Junk 20, The Office, and Arrested Development, though he would eventually guest star on the latter two. He jokingly described himself as a professional bridge burner. In 2007, O'Neal revealed he turned down an opportunity to appear on Celebrity Fit Club and said that his career is more important than his health. O'Neal made 5 appearances at the annual Just for Laughs festival in Montreal, including a one-man, one-week show at Théâtre Sainte-Catherine in 2008. O'Neal also wrote and starred in a web series called The Patrice O'Neal Show, coming soon. It featured his girlfriend, Nero, Brian Kennedy, Harris Stanton, and Will Sylvans. The series did not last long as it was unable to attain a sponsor due to its offensive content. He guest starred in another For Your Imagination produced show called Break a Leg, playing adult-sized Gary Coleman. He played the role of a warehouse worker named C. on the American TV series The Office from 2005-2007. Patrice O'Neal's character Lonnie in The Office provided hilarious and memorable moments despite having few scenes. O'Neal's departure from the show was due to his indifference towards Hollywood and a desire to be in New York. The Office didn't address Lonnie's absence after O'Neal's death, providing no proper send-off for the character. In The Office, Patrice O'Neal plays a side character who does not have many scenes but still provides hilarious moments the few times he appears. O'Neal appears in the cast of The Office in 3 episodes over the course of the first 3 seasons. O'Neal's departure from The Office wasn't immediately obvious because he wasn't part of the main cast. But after a full season without him, viewers began to question where Lonnie went. Lonnie was a different character for The Office writers to work with, one who was a little meaner and rougher than the others. However, his aggressive characterization did make him stand out in a show that worked best when it showcased quirky and awkward characters. Instead of giving a reason for Lonnie's disappearance, The Office just chooses to ignore the character and never brings him up again, so Lonnie could still have been working in the warehouse. In 2007, O'Neal performed as one of the comedians for the Comedy Central roast of Charlie Sheen, as he expressed his respect for the actor and wished to tell him in person. The show aired on September 19, 2011, with O'Neal the last comic to perform. It acquired 6.4 million viewers, still the highest-rated edition of the Comedy Central roasts. O'Neal's appearance on the roast was to be his final television appearance prior to his untimely death 2 months later. After the taping, O'Neal met William Shatner and his wife, who were also in attendance, in the garage, and the couple offered their support to O'Neal regarding his diabetes, after which the 3 cried. Shatner recalled he knew that he was dying, that he was a dying man, and in a way, he wanted to die. That's what I saw. That's why we cried. On October 26, 2011, it was announced on The Opie and Anthony Show that O'Neal, a diabetic, had suffered a stroke on October 19th. On November 29th, it was announced that O'Neal had passed.
This is going to raise money for Patrice O'Neal, one of the great, funniest stand-ups ever.
Funniest comic I ever saw. Unfortunately, passed away. I'm going to try to get through this. And
even after his passing, other comedians regarded him as one of the legendary comedians whose work fought back not by running from the stereotypes, but by refashioning them and trying them on to see what fit and what didn't, and he coaxed his audiences to do the same. O'Neal was determined that his comedy be something scary and exciting, that he and the audience were creating together. They wouldn't be able to pretend they hadn't been a part of it afterward.
Patrice got kicked out of the club. So we loved him so much, we just would go where he was. So he would be like in front of the club. So we would all just go outside, and they didn't know how to deal. And I remember they were telling him he had to leave And he was just like, oh, else what?
He found his ideal audience in 2002 at the Comedian's Table at the Comedy Cellar in New York. The Cellar is a workout club where pros try out material in 15-minute sets. Before and after going on, they often hung around the table in the back of the restaurant upstairs, gossiping and eating and arguing. Colin Quinn compared it to the round table at the Algonquin if the table were a mosh pit. Ripping down is love in comedy, says Dane Cook. It can be very cold. It's a weird hazing that comics do to keep each other on point.
When I say we would sit at this table, for 4 to 5 hours, and it would be nothing but beautiful trashings to one another.
We teased him forever, says Keith Robinson. We beat him out of himself, but Patrice gave as good as he got, then gave some more. When Patrice was around, you had to raise your game, says Rich Voss. Bill Burr prepared for even casual encounters with his old friend. I'd come up with a dozen insults, do 2 or 3, and he'd swat you to the ground. The conversation became the genesis for Quinn's show, Tough Crowd. Patrice was one of the regulars from the start. Quinn would introduce topics, race, religion, politics, and the other comics would bat them around. The stand-up Laurie Kilmartin, who wrote for the show, admired O'Neal's swagger. To get a word in, you just had to wait for him to run out of breath, she says, but she admired his range even more. He had the ability to go other places other comics couldn't go because he didn't show a lot of bitterness. He showed a lot of curiosity, she says. He would keep the ball in the air. He was leagues beyond the shock tactics and contrived political incorrectness of lesser comics. He voiced difficult and honest opinions about race and gender politics with arresting eloquence and logic. In his improvisation, he demonstrated the importance of being playful and unapologetic on stage. O'Neal's comedy was often politically incorrect by design. He didn't shy away from making jokes that pushed the boundaries of what was considered socially acceptable. Whether it was poking fun at racial stereotypes or challenging gender roles, O'Neal's comedy was unfiltered and uncompromising. Race was a recurring theme in Patrice O'Neal's comedy. He tackled issues of race relations with a sharp wit and a keen observational eye. O'Neal's approach to racial comedy was often provocative, but it also provided a platform for discussions about race and identity. He believed by talking about it, then he could get other people to talk about it too. Overall, Patrice O'Neal's comedy style was controversial, but it was also thought-provoking and boundary-pushing. He challenged audiences to confront uncomfortable truths and engage in meaningful discussions about race, gender, and society. While not everyone may have appreciated his approach, there's no denying the impact he had on the world of comedy and the conversations he sparked along the way. A fan on X, previously Twitter, said, "Going to a Patrice O'Neal show back in the day with your woman must have been hell. You can't laugh too hard, mate." Another added, "Patrice O'Neal, one of my favorite stand-ups, could just work off the crowd and be hilarious. I think as long as it's genuine, any style of stand-up is laudable." What did you think of Patrice O'Neal and his comedy style? Tell us in the comments section. That's it for this video. Bye.